Welcome everyone to episode 43 of the Brandon Adams podcast. I have with me Kyle Boddy. Kyle is the founder of Driveline Baseball. Driveline is widely considered the best place for pitching coaching in America. It was featured in the MVP machine. Kyle was recently the director of pitching at the Cincinnati Reds. Kyle, how's it going today?
Going great. Thanks for having me on.
You've recently not renewed with the Cincinnati Reds. The next position is general manager or bust. I take it you like being home at Seattle and basing at Driveline?
Yeah, especially in May, in the summer, it's beautiful. But yeah, it's definitely executive level, or, AGM, GM, special assistant. But that's where my eye is on, and that's where I think I can make the change and think I'm ready for that challenge. What's
your favorite thing about being on the road with the team versus being at home in Seattle?
The players. I mean, you can't. It's just a great feeling, when you work with the players at Driveline, they get better, they go into pro ball, you know that you have the skill, but can you manage it with the team, with those dynamics, when you actually put on the uniform and work with the players, and then to see that the work that you've been doing for decades, continues, it applies in a team setting, and even more than you thought. It's just extremely rewarding because these players are, for them, it's their career, it's their livelihood, and they don't have a lot of years to do it. So they're so hungry to get better. And then when they see the fruits of their labor and you have a small part in that journey, you can't say enough of it. When those guys go on to pitch in the big leagues on TV and talk about the same things that you talked about, and that culture continues to get pushed, that's really rewarding. It's amazing.
So many of the listeners will be familiar with your story, but some won't. So Let me start it, and then you take it from there. My understanding is that about 16 years ago, you started coaching Little League near Seattle. You became a bit obsessive about it. You have very much an analytical mindset. You have been a part-time pro poker player. You dove in head first, and you describe yourself as late to the game in reading Moneyball and not sure that you could contribute much. But then when you became obsessed about it and deep dove, now you're basically the preeminent person for pitching coaching in the nation. How do you get from 16 years ago starting this journey to where you are now?
That about covers it. It's overnight success in 16 years, so they say. There wasn't a lot of probabilistic thinking in professional sports at the time. There still really isn't in a lot of them, especially as applies to player development. Kirk Goldsberry, who you certainly know at UT Austin and then was with the Spurs, talked a lot about it when he and I talked about a lot of the analytics are being applied as surveillance, right? Like player selection, player elimination, and not a lot of development. And I think that's still true, and that's very frustrating. So that journey has really been as an econ major in college to playing professional poker, card counting, online gambling, and then taking that mindset into professional sports, but not necessarily on surveillance and spotting opportunities, but rather developing them, has been something of a niche hobby of mine always. Even when I was a gambler, I was always trying to find early to the mixed games, early to playing casino games that really no one knew, side bets, really developing new opportunities was always something that I was interested in. And that just carried over to baseball and professional sports. So I guess that's really the easiest segue from there to there.
Within baseball, on your Twitter feed, a consistent theme is that most pro teams do not cast the net wide enough in terms of looking at all of the possible players that should be in their pool. Is that fair?
Yeah, I would equate it to game selection. Forever, for years and years and years and decades, people have talked about how important it is for game selection to play at the right games, as as well as anyone. And they're just not doing a good enough job there, right? What if you restricted your games to a certain type of game, whether it's hold'em at a specific level at a specific casino, and you didn't care who you played with and whatever? In a lot of it, it's a zero-sum game. So casting the widest net and spotting the best opportunities is huge in professional gambling. It's the number one thing. And in professional baseball, there's just a draft that comes in and these players come in, and it's very rote, and they don't really think about different ways to acquire, develop players. I think it's become very stagnant on that side.
So you were extremely gracious and helped me teach a class last week at University of Miami in sports analytics. And the theme of the course was what makes a good pitcher. And this course kind of blew my mind because there were many shocking things. I would say one of the first shocking things that you said is that although a major league pitcher can, of course, consistently hit the strike zone if they want to, they're actually not nearly as precise as one might imagine. You said that basically almost no one could hit a softball size object, but it's much worse than that. Most people could not hit a basketball. How big would the target have to be for your average major league pitcher to hit the target? Let's just say it's a square target. Let's just say 75% of the time.
Yeah, it's pretty surprising, very counterintuitive, but the answer for 75% of the time with a fastball, probably I would say a radius of a circle would probably be roughly 7 inches. So it's 14 inches in diameter. Yeah, 12 to 14 inches in diameter of a circular target. Yeah, it's pretty surprising that that's considered pretty good command.
That is kind of shocking. So as someone who studies, I would say, a lot of baseball, it's fair to say that what I thought was going on before I listened to your talk was actually not what was happening at all. Like, my experience in watching baseball is the same as many fans. I spend a lot of time on MLB.com looking at where the pitches are coming in and of course watching baseball. But there's a great deal of randomness when you're just watching those baseballs come in. And most viewers are assuming that what they're seeing is much less random than it is. Do you think that's accurate?
Yeah, people think it's very deterministic, and in many ways it is. But when you start to really delve into the biomechanical side of throwing a baseball, just every single thing that can go wrong or the variance around your release point, smallest deviations at the hand cause huge deviations down the line, 60 feet, 6 inches away. And so then when you start to think about that and the replicability of motor patterns, then of course you start to accept that there is randomness and that there are days that you have the hot hand. There are days where you have better control of your motor skills, and there are days where you have worse control of your motor skills, and they're generally imperceptible. So that's a source of what you would call randomness or variance in the game that makes the game beautiful, but also makes it super frustrating.
So when you have a top pitcher like, say, Verlander is on the mound tonight, his arm is moving at about the same speed on every pitch, and his release point is about the same, but his finger position is different for every pitch. Is that an accurate description of what's happening?
Yeah, and his release point could be, whether it's a cluster of an inch for, say, the standard deviation is half an inch, still a deviation of a quarter inch at release could be up to a foot at the plate. It's crazy. And then it depends on the ball. Is it a different type of ball? Does it have mud marking somewhere? Is one of the seams not pressed correctly? And you find all these very small sources of entropy. And then when they come together, and it's pretty surprising that anyone throws as many strikes as they do. And Verlander has a very dominant strategy, right? He's very Nash equilibrium. With no runners on, he gives up the most home runs in baseball most years. He just throws balls down the middle. He doesn't care. And then with runners on, he shifts the strategy, considerably. He's more willing to tolerate walks, less willing to tolerate damage. And whether he's thought about it analytically or not, that's how he pitches. And it's pretty impressive. It's a very good strategy, the way he goes about it. And in many ways, it's funny that you said Verlander. Unknowingly, I think he's one of the pioneers of a very dominant and correct strategy on how to pitch to minimize damage. It's pretty interesting.
So you're saying he gives himself a wide margin for error when he can afford to, essentially?
Exactly. He'd rather give up 1 million home runs with no one on base rather than walk guys and get into difficult situations. And then when players are on base, he shifts his strategy. He has very different strategies.
That's great. That reminds me of a tennis book that was written by a very analytical guy. I think he was a professor, and he said that all tennis instruction books are meant for advanced players, but everyone 4.0 and below should always try to aim like for the middle of the court, 6 feet from the baseline, just to make sure they get the ball in, essentially.
I'm gonna have to read that. That sounds great. No, it's chess too, right? Ben Feingold, and I've recently started to play chess, and a long goal of mine is, potentially to become a national master. And I've been playing in rated events, and then I have a chess coach, and a lot of it is just to keep me accountable. They're not a fraudulent coach. They just said, like, you lose because you blunder. You need to blunder less. Here's the way I think about it, and just keep the pieces on the board and do basic stuff. And so when you teach chess, when I teach my kids, they're like, you're going to start with way too advanced instruction. He's like, you need to start with, like, what are the pieces' names? How do they move? And just like the very basic stuff. And I think that's very normal, is that when you start to coach something or instruction out there generally, you go to an intermediate level when you're at an advanced level, thinking that's far enough removed. And the answer is, like, not even close. Like, you really take for granted the first 10 years you were bad at something. And I think that's, people don't understand how to coach people through that and how to, like, understand to get them to do the basic stuff. It's similar in poker, right? When you're getting coaching, it's like, you just can't fold in these positions. It's obvious you should raise in these positions. If you play the hands face up, people just make mistakes consistently. It's like, if you just do that, like, if you can't even figure out how to do things correctly, when the hands are face up and all the cards are dealt, then what are we talking about? Like, why are we focusing on ranges? Why are we focusing on metagame concepts?
My friend David Gray says that he's been around poker for many decades, and in his opinion, most of the biggest winners are just like Golden Glove center fielders. They don't do anything flashy, but they don't make any mistakes. And there's a lot of truth to that.
Yep.
So based on what you're saying for Verlander, it would be difficult, if not impossible, to read the pitch in the absence of some, like, Houston Astros, like, pitch tipping or tells. And yet sometimes when players talk, they seem to say that they can read pitches. Is that mostly bullshit? Like, when Juan Soto had a viral video recently. Now, granted, Juan Soto, he's one of the best hitters in Major League, but he basically said that he's learned to read pitches, and that's why he's so good. Is that bullshit?
Yeah, it's bullshit in the way that I think they talk about it. The visual acuity is scientifically, like, fundamentally impossible, the things that they say. But what I think that I'm sure they believe it, right? But what is probably happening in talking to a lot of the best players is no different than poker, right? Like, it tells and reading specific hands. So they're just really good at ranges. Like, they're really good at narrowing ranges, right? When you're facing a pitcher and you have no idea what baseball is. You have no idea what the pitches do. You have no idea what he's going to throw, where he's going to throw it, right? And over time, that's the same thing in Hold'em and any hidden information game. And then over time, you start to realize, okay, these are the ranges they do. And then the most successful players, as you know, like, understand exactly the ranges the opponents are on, and then start to narrow them. And over time, if they have a very polarized ranges, like, they get exploited, especially at the levels that I played, right, at mid-limit poker. That's what's keeping people from being successful or moving on, is that their ranges become super polarized and shrunk. And then as the sample goes up, you start to understand exactly what to do. And then that informs the rest of your model. So a guy like Juan Soto is perfect at it. He knows exactly what he can't hit. Did he get there analytically? No. But does he innately just understand, these are the types of pitches I can't hit. These are this is the type of what it looks like. I don't swing at these pitches. When I do swing at these pitches, I do well. And Juan Soto is the best player in baseball for reasons that I think are very boring and unheralded. He just doesn't swing, which is a very dominant strategy in today's game, because I think he's understood that people's command is just not that good, like we talked about. And he just makes you throw pitches, and he just capitalizes on mistakes. And that's a very good strategy in today's game. And he's one of the best at it. Him and Stephen Kwan of the Guardians, and Mike Trout and Seiya Suzuki of the Cubs are probably the four best at it in the big leagues.
That's pretty amazing. So players are like the amateur baseball fan that thinks that the pitchers are better than they are. Now, one of the things that amateur baseball fans do is that they talk about holes that a player has in the swing, holes that the batter has in the swing, and then they imagine that a pitcher like Verlander can like pick at the holes in the swing. Like, let's just say that they're particularly bad at hitting balls low inside. And then commentators talk this way as well. Like, then they'll say, they imagine that Verlander is like picking on that. Is that something that's happening?
I would say that some are. Verlander's a good example of that, actually. So if you have his heat maps of areas that he gives up damage versus like his pitch selection, like frequency map, it's like a puzzle. Like them together is like 100% of the area. It's pretty impressive. Like he does a really good job of, and now that he's with Houston, he's really taken to the analytics portion. He's really into it. So looking at that information, he has that good of command. For relief pitchers and players that simply overpower players, like say like Shane McClanahan with the Tampa Bay Rays, or Tyler Glasnow with the Rays, they don't do that. They just throw everything in the hula hoop, they call it. Like just put the hula hoop over the plate, and if like 80% of my pitches go in it, I'm going to win because like my stuff is so good, right? And then that's, they're such an aggressive type of pitcher that they don't even think about those types of things because, to be quite honest, those two players, their standard deviation of miss is so high that they're best served by just throwing the ball over the hula hoop, right? So the Tampa Bay Rays front office analytically probably has those miss distances and thinks very algorithmically. But then how do you convince a player that their command isn't so good? So instead of saying like you're not good at something, maybe say like your stuff is so good that if all you did is throw it down the middle, you get everyone out. You appeal to their ego. They agree, and suddenly you've gotten to the right answer in a very different way, and maybe not for the exact right reason, but it doesn't matter. All that matters is that the players buy in and get better, and then that's a self-reinforcing cycle. Very
interesting. So if I'm interpreting what you're saying correctly, we know that power is very important, that fastball speed and velocity generally is very important. So if someone has that weapon, but they don't have great control, they can actually benefit from randomness just because the pitch kind of goes where it might, and it's hard for a batter to take advantage of the randomness. Whereas kind of my read on your data is that someone who doesn't rely on speed as a weapon, but instead relies on spin and control, they're in a way more vulnerable than McClanahan, because if they go for a certain spin pitch or control and miss and it doesn't have the right spin rate or whatever, then they get destroyed. Is that fair?
Yeah. Hitters have polarized their ranges to punish mistakes and to lose to basically everything else. Like that's what's happened. And that's probably the right decision given where the game is at, because to try to cover all sorts of different ranges, like they're just not able to. They're not skilled enough. So they really narrow in on one area and then hope the pitcher misses to that area. And then the best players in baseball really hone that advantage. And then that's Juan Soto and Trout, those guys that their swing rates are really low. So if you go to Fangraphs or any of those sites and sort by swing rate and you sort negatively, like inversely, whoever swings the least in baseball, you'll be like pretty surprised. I think most fans would be surprised that the people that swing the least tend to be the best players in baseball, which, is something I think Manfred and MLB is concerned with, which I think very fairly, maybe that's not the most entertaining product. So how do we get it? Then there's the entertainment part. How do we get it back to a game of more action and so forth? But in the NFL, we see this too, right? Like running the ball is just bad. It's bad. We know that. Like for game theoretical purposes, you need it and so forth, but you need it a lot less than people say. It's like bunting in baseball. You need bunting. There's a game theory component to it, but almost by saying that you need to do bunt, people over-index on bunting. It's no different than like crazy, like all-in plays in poker and things that like you should do 1% of the time. Inherently, if you tell a player like, hey, you need to do this like 3-bet light or 4-bet like shove light, these things, they're part of your game. There's no doubt about it because people need to know that it's in your tool set. But merely by saying it, people do it too much, right? So that's like the niche case that becomes way too large. You got to be careful with the language that you use with the players.
I'm hoping that you can go into stuff plus a bit. At Driveline, you guys try to distinguish effectiveness by the weapons that a pitcher has, the game plan, how they use the weapons, and then executing the game plan, which is basically having good command. And your favored way of quantifying it is a metric that you've created called Stuff Plus that is trying to, in one measure, take into account velocity, where the pitch is going, and the spin rate, the amount of movement. Is that fair?
Yep. Yeah. All of velocity and then all the components of movement. Yeah. Put together.
You break it down by pitch type so that in terms of Stuff Plus, a fastball isn't directly comparable to a slider, but a slider is comparable to another slider. Is that right?
Yep. Yeah. It's all indexed on the plus scale. So 100 is league average per pitch type.
From the work you've done, that correlates better than any other metric, including the modern defense independent metrics like XFIP and so forth. Is that right?
Yeah, it's very, very predictive. It's pretty shocking. To me, to be quite honest, it's one of those things where intuitively you know that it's going to have a large impact, and then when you just do like naive regressions and against like normal stuff, you're like, man, it has like predictive power is pretty strong. The
type of thing that you all are looking at, the type of measures, velocity and vertical break, horizontal break, these are things that you're working with all your pitchers on, or just the major league guys?
Yeah, the majority of them. The kind of the sliding scale of players as amateurs to pros is usually they don't throw hard enough. So, their speed is too low, fastball velocity. So we need to do that. And that's physicality, that's mechanics, that's our science in our motion capture lab. And that's a years long process, but they need to throw harder and their stuff needs to be better. So they need a better slider, splitter, curveball, whatever. They need to develop their stuff. And then lastly, and this is the typical progression, they need to work on their command. So their intended miss needs to go down. And then we practice that. And a player that people might want to keep their radar on that had that journey is Cole Uvula, who's with AAA with the Orioles, and he has a 0 ERA, and he's doing quite well. He was Rule 5 drafted from the Rangers to the Orioles, and he's a guy with like high spin, high Stuff Plus numbers on his pitches. And he's poised to potentially make an impact on the major league roster here fairly soon. He went from a guy in college who needed to gain a lot of velocity, then his stuff needed to get better and he needed to refine things. And then his command this offseason is the only thing we worked on, and some physicality areas of high performance. And then as a result, his command's gotten a lot better this year in AAA, and his stuff and his velocity he's retained over the 6 or 7 years that we've been training together. So it's really cool to watch that journey unfold. Because we've learned that journey along the way. It's not like we knew it 7 years ago. We have developed it over time, which has been really awesome to see some of our first year athletes, go along with us on that ride.
So pitching, you need a live arm to get to the truly elite levels. Like you need the right twitch speeds and some level of talent, I suppose, in the same way that you need a live arm to serve 135 miles an hour. But some part of velocity is teachable through better mechanics and improved gym routines and so forth.
Yeah, there's definitely a base level of athleticism, but I would argue that we don't even really know what that is. We've been continually surprised every time not every time, but a lot of the times that we declare this player doesn't have the base level of athleticism or whatever, we can be wrong. That's the beauty of the game too. It's very tough to tell. We just don't know enough. Even with the tools that we have at our disposal, and Driveline is the preeminent industry leader at it. There's a major league team in our facility right now that's touring it and seeing how we do things. And we have all this great data and these models that work, and they have strong predictive power. And yet, professional sports is a definition of a collection of outliers. Right? And that's the beautiful thing, is every one is a sample of one. Right. So generalizing, it'll never be fully encaptured by a model, right? There will always be outliers to learn from and to either incorporate that information or discard it as a true outlier. But there's plenty of that, which is pretty cool.
What's your view on junior baseball? You've sort of, I think on Twitter, spoken out against, I don't know, some of the farm system for junior baseball, where they have these expensive camps and people become well-known quantities at young ages, and it sort of distorts the system and the playing field in a way. And then, as I understand it, your initial motivation in studying mechanics was actually injury prevention rather than player improvement, because you wanted the young kids you were teaching not to get injured. What's your thoughts on the current state of junior baseball?
I think you hit it on the head right there. There's a lot of many people have covered the exploitation of kids and parents primarily. They're to separate them from their money. So it's not really something I focus too much on. I will say I agree with that. What I tend to think is that this over professionalization of baseball and expensive camps and so forth creates a very homogenous product. I was just talking to my friend who I worked with last year. He was here today visiting. We worked together with the Reds. We're both not white. We're both minority background, and we talk quite a bit about diversity and improving it in the game. And this homogenous group of players creates a very homogenous, the very low diversity in race and socioeconomic background, but additionally it creates homogenous skill sets. So that wide net, going back to that, the best area scouts that I know that go and find talent actually go and find talent. Like they go to backfield high schools in the middle of nowhere in Buffalo, New York, and find players that throw 10 innings per year, and they have a chance to make an impact on a major league roster, down the line, and draft those players. That player never is exposed in a showcase, or he's never exposed in this funnel that we put players. And that's a real problem because baseball's history is not of that, right? Soccer's history, football's history is of putting people in camps and to develop their skills and so forth. And maybe that model works well. I'm not too familiar with that. But baseball's history is truly, the history of baseball starts and ends with the scouts that go and find the talent. And that's the beauty of the game, is all these players on the backfields can be discovered at any time. And to reduce that because of lack of work ethic and because we create a homogenous product and we decide that these are the things that we want to search for, A, remove some of the magic of the game, but B, also really removes a lot of the edge of the game. So much of your edge is finding those great talents out there. And I think that the current model really reduces the opportunity and the incentive for that. And I think that A, makes it a less diverse game, which is bad, but B, also makes the game worse by skill. There's no denying that we're losing a lot of the best athletes in this country to basketball and football early. And people like to focus on the financial side of it, the economic side of it. I'll absolutely not argue against that. But I do believe that there's just a lack of interest, by funneling people into this homogenous program. It's very boring also. So get different avenues to acquire talent and to put into the pro funnel, I think it should be the number one priority of Major League Baseball.
One thing analytics has done, though, is bring people up faster from minor leagues and from college because you're able to assess them in a cleaner way. Maybe before you address that, on Twitter, there was a debate last week that you got involved in where there was a young kid, 25 years old. He finally got his chance in the minors. His stats were quite incredible over a short sample, and then he was cut. And part of the speculation was that he was the equivalent of like the number 8 guy on the tennis team who doesn't get a scholarship and beats up on the number 4 guy, but because he didn't get the scholarship, the coach doesn't want to play him, that kind of thing.
Yeah, that absolutely happens. It's very frustrating. And it's because you get locked into a type of acquisition model. Like these people are here to be the JV tennis player. I know, I've been that when I was in high school. You're here to get your ass kicked by this first singles player. And that's it. And then I never was good enough, so it's not a story about me. But, when there is some surprises, it becomes a great Disney story, right? There's movies made about Rudy and so forth, right? But the reality of it is those are all outliers. And shifting our thinking to getting the best talent on the field and removing the ego is something that is very tough to do and just hasn't really been done.
In terms of injury prevention for young players and for established players, I have a new perspective on this because I had elbow surgery 3 months ago. And I know that the way that you all think about injuries at Driveline is that you have quantifiable risk, and there's a point that is different for each player where your quantifiable risk becomes high enough that no matter what the player is feeling or what is being observed, you should just pull him because the risk is too high relative to the reward. And that way of thinking really struck a chord with me because basically when I developed the injury that caused the surgery, if I could feel the injury coming on in any way, it would have never happened. Like if there was any warning sign, like it would have never happened. It was that my risk was going up because I was doing weights fairly frequently and then also playing tennis. And I didn't know that my risk was going up. And then quite suddenly, boom, torn tendon. So how do you all think about quantifying load and stress?
Yeah, that's been the number one topic that we've been focusing on. So we have a wearable. We purchased a company called Modus Global, or their wearable division, which you wear on the elbow. It measures, works for tennis too. I should send you a sensor. And it measures throws, swings, and so forth, and the intensity of those throws. And so as a result, you can, like, building up enough information there, it gives you a good general idea of the sport-specific workload. Then we also use force plates for jumping power, right? Like how consistent are your jumps, how powerful are your jumps, compared to your baseline. And then are you getting better at that over time? Are they getting worse? And then, wearable stuff like the Oura Ring that I wear or the Whoop Strap, we integrate with their APIs and measure readiness score, and then put it all into a model to generalize, to generally check risk, right? And then where you fall on the risk scale depends, right? If you're a major league player and you're Shohei Ohtani, for example, your tolerance for risk should be fairly low comparatively. Whereas if you're a minor leaguer and you're older than Shohei Ohtani, but you're in the minor leagues, your tolerance for risk has to be much higher, right? Because to get where you want to go, you're clearly going to have to accept more risk on that continuum. So I think it's both sides of it, right? Yes, you're trying to avoid injury, but that can't be the only thing we focus on. We have to, it does no good if your availability is 100%. If you're always available, but you're not good enough to pitch in the big leagues, then it doesn't matter, right? What matters is where on the risk scale should we be? And do we have, how much of the variance around that do we have solved? And it's not 100%, but over the last 3 years, we've made quite a bit of strides. And as a result of knowing much more about risk reward and all the things that go into injury and performance, our athlete results internally have been never better. And it's been awesome to make not that shift, because that's always been Driveline's idea, but to actually have a model around that data and to have the best minds in baseball working on that every day, from high performance to the weight room, to our skill specific coaches, to our analysts. That's the real secret of Driveline, which is very hard to replicate, is that you have everyone very bought into. If you work at Driveline, you know what you're getting into. So everyone is very, very bought into this idea of a data-driven model. Now, do we have disagreements around it? Yeah, sometimes very, very fiery ones, right? But the concept of how we do it and apply it is really, it's like, that's the advanced side of it. The beginning side of it is like, let's just accept that there should be quantifiable risk, which most major league teams are just not even there.
Now, from the fan perspective, the shocking thing in terms of load management this year was Kershaw getting pulled at 80 pitches in the perfect game. Obviously, for him, he would be another person who would have very low risk tolerance. He's very expensive. He's on a team that's going to win and has plenty of depth. It's early in the season. What kind of things might go into that decision? I assume the amount of work that he might have put in the off season and things like that. How would that decision be thought of?
Yeah, I think that's in the spring training with the lockout, and he cited it too. The spring training was shortened. He didn't have a lot of pitches coming into camp. A lot of big leaguers didn't know how long the lockout was going to go. So they didn't want to, people accused him of being lazy. Well, why didn't you throw the normal time? Well, they're caught in incomplete information if they continue to train like they normally would, expecting the resolution to happen when it normally does. And what if the lockout goes 5 more months? Suddenly they've accumulated quite a bit of workload that to them is useless, right? They could have just not thrown for 3 months and decreased their risk, which is fair. And I think someone like Kershaw is a prime example of that. So when he had that shortened spring training and then this, what we call chronic workload, his baseline of workload wasn't as high as it probably usually is, because he's pretty diligent about his work. But he was restricted by time, not due to effort. And then as a result of the game, reaching on it, they just got to a point where, while a perfect game is certainly something to behold, that just maybe they both made the decision, and Kershaw's owned it and said that he felt that it was best for the team. What he privately believes, who knows? But it's easy to see why they came to that conclusion. And it's an unfortunate part of the game, but it is what it is. I went to an NBA game in San Antonio and I watched the Warriors and Steph Curry and Clay didn't play, right, because of load management. And if you're going to do it, especially post-COVID, when you shorten these seasons and the rest periods go down, that's just your professional sports are going to have to accept that that's part of the game, and fans too, which is an unfortunate part of the game. But it is what's in the player's best interest, and therefore what's in the organization's best interest.
I have a young son, Bear, who's 8. If he shows an interest in baseball, how do you start in the right way?
Honestly, the more rotational sports he can play, the better. So baseball, tennis is like probably the number one thing they should also do. The mechanics of throwing a ball and hitting a ball are very different. They're very similar, but baseball is very dependent on elbow extension velocity, like how fast this motion happens, and internal rotation. Internal rotation, so this motion. And in tennis, it's much more about elbow extension. The arm is fully extended for striking the ball at like serves. So while they look very similar, they use very different ground contact points, right? Most of the best tennis players are weightless at ball strike. When it comes to the serve, their arm is fully extended, so internal rotation doesn't happen the way that it does in the throw. And the reason that sounds like you shouldn't play tennis to get your baseball throwing faster, but it's precisely due to the differences that you want a varied map of skills. Like we find that the best command and the best development of athletes is when they're forced to make a wide variety of things that are related to the task. So that would be golf for just pure rotation, and getting it from a very restricted position, to tennis, which is much more free, to throwing a baseball, and then whatever sport you end up wanting to play, like that's all those sports combined. Hitting a hockey, like slap shots in hockey come from an unstable surface. Right. And so all these very different, and it's a much more unilateral sport. Like each single leg matters more than both total, which is not true in golf, right? Not true in baseball. So it's actually super interesting when you have this blend of varied characteristics. You actually want to avoid specialization when they're young. And furthermore, it's just more fun to play more sports. And even like activities in sports like bowling, right, teaches rotation in a very different way. So I think just having them play a bunch of different sports and always aiming to do everything at high speeds is important. And fortunately in golf and tennis, I'm not sure about tennis necessarily, but in golf and baseball, they're the predominant kind of education is to do that. Like TPI, Titleist Performance Institute, is all about developing speed and power at a young age, and then fairway accuracy at a much later age. And while people point to Bryson DeChambeau as like the poster child today, make no mistake, for people our age, we know that the poster child is Tiger Woods, right? He single-handedly changed golf by destroying the distance records and by not necessarily needing to hit fairways, because if he's in the rough but he's 60 yards further than you, it doesn't really matter how bad his lie is. Like that's just, it narrows his choices, makes it able for him to make better choices, easier choices, and that's what changed golf. And tennis, you find that serve velocity is very, very correlated with success. People will point to like random people that have high, like super fast speeds but have no other parts of their game, but I would say that like players like Taylor Dent like got a chance to play at ATP because their serve was so overpowering. It's not that Taylor, if he did other stuff better, he would have been a better player, but maybe he would have never been world rank 60, because his serve was so overpowering. So it's just one of those things. Having an unassailable single best tool is usually the best way to make an impact at the professional level. You
talk about golf and tennis, and I was surprised to hear that at Driveline, it's the same technology. It's Hawkeye and TrackMan. And one question I have for you is, I've been fortunate enough to get some raw data from tennis before, and also actually from PGA. And I've always found that when I see geographical data that's coming from, say, Hawkeye, I have no hope of interpreting it. And I don't even know anyone who knows how to interpret it. How do you deal with the challenges of geographical data?
And so by geographical data, you mean like the command, or?
With tennis, say with the Hawkeye data, which really has never been analyzed very carefully, because in tennis, the data is owned by each individual tournament. And so there's no centralized geographical data, even though on every match, like we have all of the details about how the ball is traveling. We know exactly the spin rates, where they're landing, velocity, all of this sort of stuff. But there's no real centralized data source for it. However, if If someone said, okay, Brandon, here's all of the Hawkeye data from the Miami Open, I wouldn't even know how to start. Like, it just comes in a form that I believe I would need an expert in geographical information system. I would need an expert in geographical data to interpret for me. Is that right?
Yeah, that's you do need subject matter experts, and a lot of the models that we've built off of stuff like Mike Fast and Colin Wires, and they both work for the Braves now. But there's people that have actually done that, and then actually like testing theories about like what do these things make sense, right? So just going to tennis pros and saying like, does this make sense? And then whether they say yes or no, it's not about the answer necessarily. It's about getting to like testable hypotheses, right? And that's why subject matter experts are so useful, is having someone to give you like, this is what everything I believe about tennis and how to hit shots and command and so forth. And some percentage of them are BS. So it's not about them being right or wrong or ex post facto. It's about, okay, I need a list of testable hypotheses. I don't know enough about professional tennis to generate them. Like we need Sam Aparicio or like the best coaches in tennis to just generate hypotheses, and then we'll test them. And I think that's always a really good place to go. But then that just gives you the landmark surveillance data, like gives you a way to interpret surveillance data. The real test is you don't know where the player was intending to hit a ball, right? Like, so it's not, not easy to do. So being able to chart intended versus actual is, I think, something really exciting in tennis that would be done. And we do it in baseball. Well, it's very new in baseball, like live charting intended versus actual, and then how you might be able to do that. So for baseball, you just tell the catcher, wherever you put the glove, I'm going to mark as the intended target, which sounds like normal. It sounds like that would be like the thing. But in a lot of games, like catchers, a lot of organizations, if you don't instruct them, will put the glove like on the ground. It's like, hey, throw a slider on the ground. Like we want it down and away. Now, if that's the true intended target to bounce the breaking ball, fine. But in a lot of cases, the catcher's like, no, I'm overcompensating because I want them to throw whatever. So you have to kind of instruct them like, hey, I understand you're trying to help the pitcher. That's great. But by doing an inconsistent data collection, now we can't now measure his command on pitch types. So that's more important than any micro improvement we might see in the game. What's more important is that we have consistent models and that we know that our training is affecting people. So for tennis, that's the number one thing that's like the number two thing I would want, is how can we track intended versus actual? And to your point about anyone under 4.0 just hitting balls 6 feet from the baseline, and that, like, I think it'd be really cool to like have an overhead camera or an iPhone and then plot, I intend to hit this spot 100 times and see what your average miss distance is. It'd be pretty eye-opening. As a guy who's hit a lot of baseline strokes in my day, I'd be pretty scared to see it.
Yeah, well, tennis is a unique game because it's so hard to be profitably aggressive, right? Because most people have good reach and are pretty fast. So to be profitably aggressive, you have to string together like 3 strong shots in a row, which is a tough parlay. You know what I'm saying? So it often pays to be defensive. Even at the ATP level, Djoko is essentially a counterpuncher. He's just the most amazing counterpuncher the world has ever seen.
We can say that that's changed due to like technology. So obviously when I was growing up, and part of this is just my background, but I was a huge fan of Michael Chang growing up, right? And like that type of, speaking of, counterpunchers and baseline, but it was kind of the game, as David Foster Wallace likes to say, has been to a brutal art of power baseline players, right? Ivan Lindell and so forth coming through. And now every player hits the ball with incredible pace, such that like approaching the net, being profitably aggressive is very difficult because balls hit from the baseline are hit 30 kilometers per hour faster than they ever were. And a lot of it is due to equipment advancements. Do you think so? Baseball faces this problem in pitch design and other ways, but I think tennis has faced a shift in their game away from the Changs and Connors to more of the the Roddick's of the world. So I'll pose the question to you. Do you think technology has made that change? And like, where's the next area for tennis from that?
It's similar to baseball, where they always make changes in the structure of the game based on what they think the fans want. Like, obviously runs are way down this year, and I don't know your view on that, whether it's just weather or whether it's statistical chance or whether it's the change in the ball and so forth. The players seem to think that some combination of a a deader ball with different use of the humidors and things like this has caused the lack of runs. I don't know your view on that, but at any rate, some people think that was a decision somehow from up high. In tennis, what definitely happened is that there was a decision from up high to make court slower and balls slower. And so in the, 25 years ago, you had players like Greg Ruzetsky, which, nice guy, great commentator, but didn't have much of a game other than like 140 mile an hour serve. That player would not be possible today. I guess you have some isolated examples that are just so amazing and serve like a Karlovic or something, but largely speaking, that game type has become impossible because the courts are much slower and the balls are much slower. So that was a decision on the organizer's part because fans like more intricate points. The other big change that happened was the string changes, even more so than racket changes, allowed players to hit very, very precise shots. They're just so unbelievable now in hitting passing shots because the strings allow for such high levels of spin and so much precision. Like they can just hit the ball on a dime. It's really not at all like what you described for the baseball pitchers. Like they can be extremely accurate. You can see it, like they hit these just beautiful, tight cross-court passing shots, and they're not missing them very often. Joko can thread a passing shot down a line like repeatedly. So that's a lot strings. So any form of aggression, it requires this tough parlay of 3 or 4 shots put together. And so counterpunching is quite effective. Now, what the counterpuncher looks like on the ATP level, they have a lot of bite on the ball, but still the overall strategy is basically defensive in nature.
And yet, one of the most watched games, right, is the Eisner Mahut ridiculous marathon. So it's funny to see that the problem is that when you have sports analytics and you have economics, people that are familiar with just like strategy, not necessarily even analytics. I try to divorce, as someone that's an economist yourself, right, the concept of economic modeling versus like financial and like very statistical. I think it's very different from a human analysis perspective. And just saying like the problem, so to speak, is that these games they laid unoptimized for a century, right? And then you have people that are just smart, just like this is a beatable game. And then, like they're not playing the game optimally. Like no one did anything wrong. It's just that as soon as people started looking into it, like in the NBA, it's like 3 is greater than 2. It just took a long time for people to understand, and when you make these changes, like it inherently changes the game. And does it make it less entertaining? I don't know. Like I think that it's very common to say that baseball is less entertaining when there's more strikeouts and more homers, but it maybe is that a self-defeating prophecy. Maybe it's because we talk about it that way and maybe we don't frame it that way. And, I don't know, yet we love watching reruns of Kerry Wood striking out 20 guys and Roger Clemens doing it and Barry Bonds hitting a million homers. So historically, when we look back at all of our things that we talk about, we don't talk about the games that were over in 2 hours and had a lot of ground ball outs. We talk about these outlier games that have crazy things happen. And then yet on the daily basis, we say these things aren't exciting. So it's hard for me to believe that that's necessarily the truth. It's just hard to say, and same with tennis. I think I get that like the constant rallies and so forth are probably more impressive, yet, people love watching clips of the hardest serves ever, right? Those are always have a lot of views on YouTube.
And so certain streaks like Sampras at Wimbledon, that probably couldn't happen. I would be inclined to say that wouldn't happen in the modern era now that Wimbledon is much slower. But Sampras was a guy who made a study of the serve and had what was the perfect serve, right? If you're thinking about release points and spin rates and hitting your targets and variety and all of that, like he was the perfect guy. Every toss looked the same, every motion looked the same, but where the ball landed and what spin it had was quite different. And the result was that he held serve 97% of the time at Wimbledon. That's pretty hard to beat.
Yeah, it's not easy when you always win with the white pieces, effectively. Like not easy to win the match.
So I would be remiss if I didn't ask about analytics from a fantasy perspective, because I do have people that are interested in both season long and daily fantasy here. So pitching is a big part of the game of daily fantasy. You're trying to predict pitcher performance. I guess a starting point is in the minds of daily fantasy players, they have a ranking of pitchers. And my own sense is that they're overconfident in the ranking of pitchers, and there's probably a good bit more randomness than one would think. Do you think that is true, or do you you would be able to rank pitchers better than anyone? Do you in your mind have a very firm hierarchy in pitchers? Like, I think someone who knows the NFL very well, they could have a very strong hierarchy of quarterbacks and be essentially correct. But I'm wondering if the same is possible in baseball.
Yeah, I think that there's considerable randomness. Yes, I think there's tiers are probably the best way to do. I know that DFS people do think of it that way. But yeah, strict rankings of who the best player is, or, I think it's very overblown and that's just evident in the back-to-back Cy Young winners, of which there are very few, right? It's just the control. There's just a huge amount of randomness on batted ball luck and just injuries, right? Players can throw 200 innings a year, but need not be healthy for some portion of them. Like they can just they take painkillers and get through it, right? And their command gets worse and so forth. So there is quite a bit of randomness there. And what I've noticed in fantasy sports and talking to my friends, they make there's a lot of the same errors that happen as in front offices in baseball, which is kind of funny, which is that the components that they look on are very surface level. They may seem advanced, like XFIP and Sierra and weighted runs created. And those things are all great, but that's open information, and that everyone's analyzing it and just placing a different model over it, which means it's just your opinion. And there's really very little hay to make there. But on the side of Stuff Plus and breaking ball changes and adjusting for organization, like which organizations do a good job developing talent, which organizations do a poor job, right? And those things over time really matter, especially in season-long analyses, but even in daily fantasy sports, because a player may be on the major league roster for a team, and that team might have a really good might be good at developing players, and that player starts off the season extremely poorly or in line with his projections. But all the projections you read on Fangraphs and so forth they assume that player development in every organization is held constant, right? That's just not true. Like, everyone knows that the Kansas City Royals do a poor job of developing pitchers. We know that. And yet the same projection algorithm that you use, will be applied to players in the Royals as the same as the Giants, as the same as the Guardians, and that's just silly. Right? Like, their projection should be wildly different. And yet that's very rarely factored in. And in my experience, never factored in. So things like fastball velocity, which Steamer projections uses, but very few others do, Stuff Plus, and tracking which organizations have a history of developing players and have acquired coaches that do a good job, I think is a very underexplored side of it. Right. And the most common one that's on Twitter, and I think a big meme, is the cheating lab that the San Francisco Giants have, which I think is a great way to put it. Like, Alex Cobb is having a great year. Jacob Junis from the Royals, now they're having a great year and so forth, and they're throwing harder. Both those players actually end up training Driveline. That's just part of it, right? But the Giants are not only, they do a great job of themselves, but they also embrace, individuality. They embrace training programs from outside the organization. And then they see the results are what they are. They're not that surprising, So I think adjusting for organization is an area where maybe there's an edge that people aren't investigating.
From a fantasy perspective, there are times when upside is at a premium, and there are times when consistency is at a premium. What are the characteristics of a pitcher that has high upside?
High variance. So high walk rates, high strikeout rates. I'm thinking of a couple pitchers with the Tampa Bay Rays. That would be it. But any given day, where you can see crazy, like Tim Lincecum would probably be the number one guy for me, right? The Cy Young winner, back-to-back, or I think back-to-back, and then won another one after that. There are games that he would pitch 2 innings and give up 1 million runs. It's amazing, right? Like, how is that possible? And it's because like their command is pretty poor. Their average miss distance is high. So on a day that it's abnormally high, you just see really outlier results. And on a day that their average miss distance is abnormally low, you see some of the best baseball ever. Right. So going with like high stuff guys, high walk guys is a nice way to buy some variance for sure.
So like a Blake Snell, it throws real hard and has a lot of variety. And
Blake Snell, historically Robbie Ray, although that's changed considerably lately. He's now just one of the best pitchers in baseball. But, before it was a high variance guy. You never really knew what you were going to get. And
you said earlier that there are some days where their mechanics are just better. So it's not all randomness. There is just off days for the guys where they're not feeling good and they're putting release points are bad. Their fingers are in bad positions. And
yeah, absolutely. Just, maybe going through a breakup at home. They're humans too, right? So they're just there's bad days at work and so forth. And so they're pitching every fifth or sixth day, and every 5 days, do you feel the same? No. They're professional athletes. They're paid to be machines, but the truth is they're not. They're mid-20s men with the same problems other mid-20s men have that aren't related to money, but they have all the same issues. So there's going to be up and down support there. And that's to the fan, that's randomness. To the individual, it's deterministic. But then knowing it is nearly impossible, right? Because the player often doesn't even know themselves.
And so the high consistency guy would be first defined by a low walk rate, or how it?
I would say so. Yeah, I would say that a low walk rate, someone that throws a high strike percentage and has like a very kind of defined plan and is a veteran. So Kyle Hendricks is like a pretty good example of that. Is a guy with a low walk rate and like lowish strikeout rate. But if you need to buy consistency, Hendricks is like probably one of the better ones, and he has like pretty steady. The average is close to the median, I would guess, in runs given up like per game.
I like it. Well, I'm at my time limit, but I do have one final question for you, because I had the fun experience this quarter of teaching sports analytics at University of Miami. All of the students want to work in sports, ideally for a team. I had Shane Battier come in and tell them what it was like to work at the Heat. He basically told them that they're never going to see Jimmy Butler. They're never going to talk with Spo. They didn't care. They don't care if they're in a windowless room. They just want to work for a team. Someone who wants to work in baseball and is currently in college or grad school, what advice do you have for them?
I really would like to hear Shane's talk now. That sounds about right. You just got to be able to create value. So much of it used to be connections, or the Harvard and where you went and going to the same school that the GM went. Amherst, obviously very popular now. But right now, with the internet being the way it is, just creating, something different, models, and being able to get it to the field, right? The baseball is full, and basketball too, is full of smart people that know exactly what to do and how to solve the game and how to get that, that strategy. It's like, this is an unassailable strategy. Like, here's all our models. It's definitely good. Why doesn't anyone do it? And like, if you really think about that, that's you passing the buck, right? So if you have these models you developed, or this great information, as someone who's studied quite a bit of academic, information and theory, how can you get it to the field, right? So volunteering for a college team, volunteering for like little league, high school, so forth, things that seem like they're beneath you or crazy aren't. Like, being able to show that you've actually applied some analytical concepts, whether it's in player development or scouting or so forth, to an actual field, need not be at the highest level, but that you've actually done it, shows A, that you're willing to do that type of work, and B, that there might actually be some applied concept to your theoretical work, because people should be ready to be humbled when you have all these models and things that you think predict RA9 and so forth. And like, we know these things would work, and if we use an opener or whatever, like if we just use pinch runners differently, the vast majority of that information has been mined and sits in a database and just sits in a Atlassian Jira file somewhere, just sits somewhere. But like, what coaches are willing to actually, like, A, convince players of it, B, being willing to get them to test it, and then C, generate results in a rigorous way. And that is sorely lacking. So the ability to get out there and actually help players and coaches is, I think, the number one way to get noticed in the game, in baseball, basketball, anywhere. I think is by far the biggest inefficiency and the biggest way to get noticed.
I love it. Well, Kyle, thanks so much. This was great.
Awesome. Thanks. And I'll get down to Miami soon, hopefully.